we were examining climate and environmental justice, but we were focused on this question, big question, of how we narrate how we got to these environmental crises. In order to meet the crises that we face now, how do we assign responsibility, and how do we come to terms with that, the responsibility that Christianity has in this? So do we need, fundamentally, at the end of the day, do we need a new religion, or do we need a new worldview? And we saw that Lynn White says, basically, the answer is yes, that Christianity is responsible for the ecological crises in which we have landed, and therefore we need Christianity to solve the problem, or we need a new Christianity, a new radically revised religion, or maybe we need a completely new religion. But we need a religious solution because the cause was religious. Christianity bears the brunt of the responsibility. And then we saw kind of rejoinders to that from Wendell Berry, from Pope Francis, that yes, Christianity may be complicit in various ways. Certainly, Christianity got caught up in the modern technological paradigm in many ways, but it also is false to say that it bears primary responsibility for arriving at where we are today. And the problems really lie primarily with changes that took place in modernity, with the rise of science and technology, and a kind of transformation of a worldview that took place during that time. And in fact, Christianity provides many resources for responding to these crises. So it's not so much a matter of, oh, we need a new religion or we need a radically changed religion. Actually, the resources lie perhaps in reaching back into the past and reconnecting with strands of the tradition that are there that have been kind of submerged within modernity. So that was really last time. So today we are thinking about when you then try to tackle these problems, do you need to focus primarily on getting the worldview right? So if a wrong worldview has been problematic, technological paradigm or whatever it is, do you focus on fixing that worldview, or do you focus on practices, changing what we do? And how do we relate those two to one another? And then this central question of the relationship between ecocentric and environmental justice paradigms. Are those going to be fundamentally in conflict with one another? Are there ways to bring them together so that they're actually working hand in hand? And maybe a subordinate question here, and something to think about as you do the readings, is what place is the language of rights playing for these thinkers? What role can rights discourse play here? So rights talk has overwhelmingly focused on human beings. When we introduced rights discourse earlier in the semester, we focused, say, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So human rights, right? I mean, that was just taken for granted, that the holder of rights is a human being, and that really the priority is to make sure that all human beings get these rights. So that's what the major focus of the work of the United Nations has been, is securing universal human rights, but they're human rights. So now we get into this place where we're opening up the question of who can intelligibly be a rights holder? Can non-human animals intelligibly be rights holders? Can rivers, can mountains, can the earth itself be a rights holder? And you see some of this discourse coming up in the readings for today. Well, basically, Willis Jenkins, George Tinker, and Pope Francis all agree fundamentally that it's not sufficient to fix worldviews, even if worldviews matter a great deal. And we'll see some nuances in the way in which they think that the priority has to be placed. Often, you have to begin with practices in order to transform worldview. So we want to digest that. And moreover, they argue that concern for people and for the earth, for eco-justice, and for environmentalism can actually complement rather than compete with one another. So we want to be thinking about whether we think this argument succeeds. If we critique anthropocentrism, as we find so often, obviously, in this kind of discourse, if we defend more than human rights, are we privileging the non-human over the human? Does a critique of anthropocentrism need to turn the tables in this way? Or is there a way to hold all things? So Willis Jenkins, we're reading a chapter from his book, The Future of Ethics, published in 2013. Willis Jenkins was actually on the faculty here for a while before he returned to UVA, which was his alma mater. And he hammers at Lynn White. He worries that the legacy of Lynn White has been this undue focus on worldview. So we just got to fix the worldview, and then everything will fall into place. And this, Jenkins argues, is completely inadequate. And it's inadequate, especially in the face of wicked problems like climate change. Now, wicked problem, this is a term that was first used in 1973 in the field of social design theory, but has really caught on now. We're talking about climate-related problems and other ecological problems. What is a wicked problem? I don't know if you can read that fine print up there, but there are those who came up with this term, wicked problem, tried to actually define it in some way in relationship to a number of characteristics. That a wicked problem is when it's really intractable, that there's chronic policy failure every time there's an effort to address it, in part because a wicked problem cuts across organizational boundaries and responsibilities, so it's not clear that this is the party that's responsible for fixing it. It's like who is responsible for fixing this? It's such a big, loose, difficult to define problem. It involves changing behavior in pretty fundamental ways. It's very socially complex. There's no clear solution. There are unintended consequences when you try to introduce a solution. There are multi-causal forces. There are many interdependencies. So something like climate change is a wicked problem. And Jenkins suggests that our ethical traditions, and he would include Christian ethical traditions, seem incompetent in the face of the difficulty and the complexity of wicked problems. These wicked problems seem distant from individual actors, and so much traditional ethics is about individual actors, my responsibilities to you. And yet we're caught up in this very, very complex multi-causal system. And the impact of recognizing this incompetence of received ethical traditions can be despair. And that's something we hear a lot about today, right? Climate despair. So does climate despair issue from the incompetence of our ethical traditions? And if so, what do we do? And Jenkins thinks that Lynn White represents the cosmological temptation, the temptation to think that narrating this story right, getting the worldview right, will somehow solve a wicked problem. But it's a temptation to fall into this worldview approach. It's a temptation because narrating a new story, retrieving a forgotten moral vision, doesn't make our received traditions competent if they're incompetent. It doesn't actually address the wickedness of these problems, their complexity. So what to do? Well, Jenkins suggests that we need to look to creative practices of communities on the ground, grassroots responses, what he sometimes calls reform projects. These are projects that start from concrete problems that are local. So it doesn't necessarily try to address practically the whole wicked problem, but it goes somewhere at something definable. And it may draw on the resources of traditions, even though these traditions are incompetent. And this stretches and transforms these traditions and these resources so that they acquire what he calls new moral competencies. You confess the incompetence of these traditions, but you don't toss them out the window. So we're reading a chapter of this book called Toxic Wombs and the Ecology of Justice it's a chapter that is really grappling with the disconnect and the tension, and sometimes the conflict between environmental justice, environmental racism approaches to ecological problems, and conventional environmentalist approaches. So here are the stereotypes, we could say. Conventional environmentalism is ecocentric. Right? It privileges the untouched wilderness, nature. It tries to correct anthropocentrism. But in the process, it tends to somehow embrace further this narrative of white settler colonialism, discovering the untouched wilderness, trying to preserve it. On the other hand, we have environmental justice movements that are anthropocentric. They're focused on the human beings who are suffering. Don't focus on untouched wilderness. Don't focus on nature. Focus on urban areas and the ways in which they're polluted and the ways in which where is toxic waste sited? Where is it sent? It's sent into poor communities. You can think all you want about the beauty of nature, and it won't help you solve the problem of toxic waste, pollution, and who is affected. The poor, the people who lack the resources to go out and to hike into the national parks, right? Conventional environmentalism is a discourse primarily of whites. Environmental justice has been focused on people of color who are bearing the brunt of structural racism and colorblind policies that impact their communities. So that's the clash, the way it gets set up. And I want to ask you to spend just a few minutes with the person next to you. Can you think of a concrete example of a place where this kind of clash emerges? And how does one go about addressing it? The clash of paradigms, the clash of approaches, and where does it rear its head, and what does one do? Terrific reflections. So Jenkins is very aware of these conflicts, these tensions, and is trying to move beyond them, or rather to show that those who are actually involved in on-the-ground environmental justice projects are themselves moving beyond this opposition in transformative ways. So in part two, there is a challenge here to how ethics has traditionally conceptualized injustice and conceptualized rights, including what I touched on a moment ago, this question of whether rights are only about persons or only about human persons. He suggests that practices that are born from maternal resistance, his term, maternal resistance to childhood toxic exposures now support projects to establish rights for Mother Earth. So we have this new discourse of rights can be applied to something like the earth, characterized as Mother Earth, but rights for Mother Earth, which sounds like the sort of project that would come out of maybe conventional environmentalism, ecocentric, is actually coming out of an environmental justice project that is focused on children being exposed to toxic waste. So he suggests that environmental justice projects draw attention to the way that political power shapes ecological systems. Analyze the power here. But these projects that he's interested in are grassroots projects. They're not operating at the macro scale, and they're disproportionately, he suggests, projects that are led by women who traditionally have not had massive amounts of political power, and that often they deploy tropes of motherhood. So he suggests that women draw connections between the toxic chemicals that they easily pass along to their offspring and broader reflection on the ecological web. So you discovered that the PCBs that are accumulating in a mother's milk might also hinder reproduction in whales, and you identify there's a common poison here that's affecting the whole system. It's affecting the whole matrix of life. It's indifferent to species differences. And Jenkins suggests that this kind of thinking emerges organically out of the practice of such movements, struggles against toxic threats that might lead caregivers to protect all those things on which we together rely for our survival. Now, what about all this motherhood talk, this womb talk? Well, he acknowledges that there might be essentializing, romanticized notions of women, of mothers, of wombs, connection among embodiment, the earth, women, and so on. He acknowledges concerns raised by ecofeminists, but he argues that this is not a reason to turn away from environmental practices on the ground, that would be another form of classism, potentially of racism, to come floating in and to say, your discourse has to be normed by these rules. So that's something else to grapple with here, because we're going to hear it. We hear it in Pope Francis. We hear it in George Tinker. We're hearing it echoed by Willis Jenkins here. These gendered notions of the earth, gendered notions of our interconnectedness, our emplacement in a womb that can be poisoned and needs to be attended. And what do we do? What do we do with that, right? What do we do with that essentialized gender? He draws our attention to very, very important grassroots movement that took place in Warren County, North Carolina, 1978. PCB was being dumped there, and Black women organized themselves and invented the term environmental racism to begin to try to name what was going on. And we see the power of naming things. The power of naming things. So it's not just practices, right? It's not just the protests. It's how do you make the protest effective, right? How do you make the issue visible? How do you get people to see what they're just not seeing? They're not acknowledging. The Warren County protests, as they're called, really, really important for understanding how attention to structural racism developed. And the basic issue here is one I think we now recognize, that toxic waste is concentrated where land is cheap. Like somebody has to pay for putting the waste somewhere, and it's, in a sense, it's a simple economic decision that's made by companies. They just want to pay the least amount possible for getting rid of those waste. And you could say it's a colorblind decision. They're not saying, oh, we want to put this in communities of color because we want to poison these people. They're just trying to make an economic decision. But this colorblind decision concentrates toxic waste in poor communities, and poor communities are disproportionately inhabited by people of color because of the history of racism in this country. So rights to equal protection under the law can be violated through mundane decisions made on pure economic grounds by companies. So he's trying to identify what are some of these grassroots movements? How do they name the problem? How do they make it visible? How do they actually function? And he acknowledges that the concern that's raised on the part of mainstream, the old environmental, ecocentric environmentalism, is that environmental justice movements might somehow disparage the value of other species. They're trying to focus on the human and human suffering. Well, are they therefore blind to the value of other species? And he thinks that this language that sometimes crops up in environmental justice movements of a complaint against focus on, say, charismatic megafauna, this discourse shouldn't be taken at face value, because the anthropocentrism, if we want to call it that, which we probably shouldn't, that crops up in environmental justice movements is not finally about a meta-ethical prioritization of human beings across the board. It's not fundamentally an affirmation that humans matter and other living things or the earth do not matter. What it is an epistemic priority for those oppressed by white power. That is, it is calling us to recognize forms of suffering, forms of injustice that are simply not registering, that must be attended to. So we need to see our environmental problems as historical problems. We need to trace how they developed, where they came from, what are the practices in which they're rooted. And that will involve also seeing human beings as part of ecosystems, seeing human interests as connected with the interests of other creatures, that competition and conflict are the surface, but interconnectedness and interdependentness are the fundamental underlying reality. So if we see how human beings are part of these ecosystems, we see how the degradation of people and the degradation of their ecosystems are inextricably connected. To focus on better conditions for life, for people, is also to focus on better, healthy, more healthy ecosystems. So this begins to change the subject of justice. So the subject of justice is no longer just humans. The subject of justice is expanded, and human personhood is expanded. He thinks we can draw wonderful resources for this from many, many sources. And again, this is sort of epistemologically, where do we find these insights? Connecting back to something we talked about early on in the semester, the epistemological privilege of the oppressed. Who is seeing what is going on? Where do you have to be situated in order to see these realities? One thing that's often ignored is the fact that environmental justice movements are often church-based movements. They're often, or religious movements, or spiritual movements in some sense. And maybe we overlook this because we think that a religious approach is going to be focused on worldview. It's not going to be focused on grassroots organizing. Maybe these look too pragmatic, insufficiently cosmological. But that may be a white viewpoint, that a religious response to a problem is a cosmological response to a problem. A religious response to a problem is a worldview-based response to a problem. Is that the way that white people have typically understood what counts as a religious response? James Cone critiques white eco-theologians for being methodologically racist because they start from worldviews of creation instead of starting from experiences of oppression. What's your starting point? And womanist thinkers are an important site for linking environmental justice and the attention to experiences of oppression with theological reflection. So we might think about someone like Dolores Williams, who is drawing on categories of both liberation and survival as a starting point. Or we might think about indigenous activists who have made Mother Earth central to their ecological struggles, who claim rights for Mother Earth. Again, this rights language being stretched, being deployed in new ways, taking those resources from traditions and transforming them. Rights for Mother Earth, in this case, right, rights importing this Western notion, ethical notion, into indigenous ways of thinking. It's another form of stretching and transforming an ethical framework. To claim rights for Mother Earth, among other things, is a way of saying ecological membership, ecological belonging, comes before cultural belonging. And we're going to distort our cultural frameworks if we don't recognize that priority of the ecological. To hurt Mother Earth, again, we've got the gendered language, to hurt Mother Earth is to harm the sustaining womb of all people. Human rights ultimately cannot be protected unless the rights of Mother Earth are protected. That rights language, which can seem to make sense only when applied to the human, starts to sound right when you personify the earth. Mother Earth, oh great, Mother Earth. Mother Earth can have rights. You stretch the language by rhetorical forms of description that change our imaginations. So Willis Jenkins says, the environmental justice movements hybridize the discourses of human rights and ecological cosmology to open a third way. Hybridize, so you bring together these discourses of human rights and of ecological cosmology and create a new language with them. You deploy the most important moral ideal of liberal culture, human rights, and you bring that together with the symbol of imperiled biocultural worlds, Mother Earth. And bringing that together creates a powerful combination that becomes a tool for resisting ecological destruction. So approaches like this are not finally either anthropocentric or ecocentric. He calls them anthropocosmic. That we need a new language to get beyond this conflict, or apparent conflict. We can talk about justice for Mother Earth. And what justice for Mother Earth involves is sustaining conditions for human beings who are capable of affirming the sacredness of Mother Earth. So human beings, you might say, are the interpretive center of the cosmos, but they're not the value center of the cosmos. What human beings can do is recognize the value of all things, the value of all creatures. So Jenkins suggests that Christian indigenous thinkers are also playing an important role here in stretching and transforming traditions. And we turn ourselves to George Tinker. George Tinker, and to his book, American Indian Liberation, A Theology of Sovereignty, which is a book from 2008. George Tinker is professor of American Indian cultures and religious traditions at Iliff School of Theology. His mother is Lutheran, his father is Osage, so he is an indigenous Christian. He has a PhD in biblical studies from Graduate Theological Union, and he's an ordained pastor. So he is working at this interface between Native American spirituality and Christianity and trying to forge something of a pathway for Native American Christians beyond Western settler colonialism. And the chapter that we are reading together is a chapter that's focused on eco-justice. It's focused on the ways in which ecological devastation particularly affects indigenous and other people of color, not just on this continent, of course, but globally. And he's concerned with worldview, but as I suggested briefly last time, he doesn't think that the path toward transformation begins by fixing a worldview. It begins by returning native lands to the sovereign control of native peoples. And only in this way can the gift of their worldview bear fruit for the world. This is his basic thought. How might the indigenous worldview or worldviews bear fruit for the world? Well, that needs to begin by a dramatic transformation in which native lands are returned to the sovereign control of native peoples. Now, he acknowledges that there's a danger of romanticizing indigenous peoples, romanticizing their spiritual and mystical insight. He acknowledges, too, that there is danger of overgeneralizing. You just like Native American, indigenous, and not attending to the specificity and the distinctiveness of different groups. But at the end of the day, he does think that the commonalities suffice in order to be able to offer native spiritualities as an alternative to the modern world system that is driven by the accumulation of profit and capital. And he is concerned that whatever resources Christianity might have, Christian churches have continued to sustain this capitalist system, that Christian privilege is operative even in efforts to engage with indigenous spiritualities, and that there is a fundamentally dangerous privileging of human beings in Christian theology that goes hand in hand with an anthropomorphizing of God. And so fundamentally, he wants to suggest that a gift of indigenous spirituality is a gift of correcting this anthropomorphizing of God that leads to the privileging of human beings, and instead suggests that we might learn from the concept of wakoda, of a spiritual force or energy permeating the whole of the world. So an immanent notion of the divine, manifest in countless ways in the world around us, and can correct a notion of creation as something that human beings confront and can manipulate and relate to from the outside. Notions of stewardship that we find in Christianity, he suggests, are not sufficient because they still construe human beings as being in charge. And he says, in indigenous understandings of the world, human beings are not in charge. We're just a part of the whole and not dominant. We are, in fact, often perceived as the least of all species, the ones who are confused, who need to learn from their elder brothers and sisters, other species, other creatures. We'll have a few minutes at the end here to reflect on how Pope Francis in Laudato Si tries to position Christianity with respect to some of these kinds of concerns, and highlight a couple of these. First of all, Laudato Si argues that creation is not properly understood as something apart from human beings, that human beings relate to from the outside, that doesn't capture Christian understanding of creation, but human beings are part of creation over against God as creator. And that understanding the radical transcendence of God is also affirming the immanence of God, that God is intimate to us in creation, and that, to this point that Tinker makes about whether human beings are thought to be in charge, Laudato Si underscores the claim that God is in charge, that human beings are not in charge. But human beings do bear responsibility. We're part of the whole, but we are a part of the whole that's capable of understanding that we're part of the whole. And so to be that in that particular form of situatedness is to bear a certain kind of responsibility. But Tinker, too, despite his insistence that human beings are not in charge, also acknowledges human responsibility. He says there are expectations of human beings. There are expectations of human beings. We have particular responsibilities in the scheme of things. But he goes on immediately to say that all things have their responsibilities. And it is only we two-leggeds who seem to be confused as to our responsibility toward the whole. Now, what would Pope Francis say to that? He would say, well, we might use the language of responsibility a little bit differently here, because I think Pope Francis would want to say, to have a responsibility, you need to be aware of that responsibility. You need to recognize it, and you need to be capable of either fulfilling it or not fulfilling it. Tinker is using responsibility in a different way, according to which you could say that other creatures who simply do what they do, are what they are, they fully enact their being as creatures, they can't fail to fulfill their part in the whole. But he too recognizes that human beings differ in being capable of failing in their responsibilities. Tinker worries about an emphasis in the West on the individual over against the community. Laudato Si echoes that as well. Shared concern with the individualism that has become so ingrained in the West. Tinker calls us to focus on interrelatedness, balance, mutual respect, and that this, he considers, the greatest gift of Indian peoples to Amer-European people, and perhaps as a corrective to a particular understanding of creation that has fed into technological control. We must be always attending to the balance of existence and the ways in which that balance of existence, when disrupted, affects the well-being of all creatures. So what is needed? What is to be done, according to Tinker? Many things, recognizing the links between ecological and social injustices, changing holistically and systemically. And he thinks that that does call for philosophical and theological foundations, but not foundations in the philosophical sense of treatises, system building. No, we need stories. We need stories that express the self-identity of communities, stories that connect with us affectively. And this is something that the churches have not yet begun to do. Even as we move away from individualism, the nation state is not the solution. So recognizing that we need holistic approaches, that we need systemic approaches, does not, in his view, mean turning to solutions that flow from the nation state. Why? Because the nation state has undercut native sovereignty at every turn. He sees no basis for trust in the nation state. And this is why he turns instead to the question of native sovereignty. And he makes a big claim here that the answer to the question of native sovereignty may contain something of the answer of sustainability for all people on the earth. Very interesting claim. And this is, of course, a huge project. Indigenous Indian native nations in this just in the U.S. alone may well have legitimate land claims to about 2/3 of the land mass. So this is a utopian project. There's no organized movement, really, to speak of behind this call. So big question hovering here is, what does it mean to say you must begin here? You must begin by restoring native sovereignty. If we should begin with practices rather than worldviews, what kinds of practices should we begin with? Should we begin with utopian movements? Should we begin with very local grassroots initiatives? And I've run on too long, so I need to say less about Laudato Si that I would have liked, but I wanted to point to some convergences. So I would just ask you to be on the lookout for convergences as you do these readings, really interesting ways in which Pope Francis is, in a way, like you could see him responding to some of Jenkins' concerns. You could see him responding to some of Tinker's concerns, responding to some of Lynn White's concerns. He, too, is stretching the language of rights and stretching the language of justice. And he, too, is doing it in some of the same ways by personifying the earth, speaking of Sister Earth and Mother Earth. And that's a way of getting us to feel like the language of rights and the language of justice can be used here. And then when it comes to what is to be done, what's striking about Laudato Si is that it identifies pretty much every possible level as you must make progress on this level. There's no answer to the question of where should you begin. You must begin everywhere at once. And so some of the changes that need to happen are on the level of international legal governance, global governance structures, the financial sector, right? Fossil fuels, but so much more. But he doesn't say, okay, well, we can't do that, so we can't fix the problem, so let's just talk about worldview instead. No, he also points to a host of very, very local things, everything from boycotts to local energy cooperatives to ecological spirituality. So there's sources for hope, right? So you don't just say, oh, we can't do the utopian structural transformation, so we're off the hook. It's all hands on deck. It's all approaches simultaneously. It's worldview and practices hand in hand. It's eco-justice and ecocentrism hand in hand. It doesn't solve all of the important specific situations in which one must make a specific decision about priority. Right? The difficult questions about setting priorities will remain. But there's, I think, a paradigm shift that is taking place pretty rapidly, leaving behind the framing of this conversation in terms of either ecocentrism or environmental justice, and that we see it across the board. If you can see it in George Tinker and you can see it in Pope Francis, then you start to get the feeling that there is a dramatic shift that's taking place across the board. Thank you very much, and I will see you Thursday.